So we've talked about two of the classes of vertebrates so far. So over the past few days, we talked about fish and their adaptations. We talked about amphibians and their adaptations. Today we're going to move on and talk about reptiles. So the order that we're covering these classes in is the order that they evolved in on Earth. The first vertebrates that had evolved on Earth were fish. Okay? And at first, vertebrates were only in the water. But eventually, a small group of fish kind of split off, and that is the group that evolved into amphibians. Because obviously fish depend on being in the water for their whole lives. Amphibians, however, could do what? Spend part of their time on land. But still, amphibians still needed to be linked to the water for what? So what do they always have to return to the water for?
To cool themselves down.
Not quite. Yeah, amphibians. Something. Yes, to reproduce. So amphibians couldn't live in completely dry environments. They always had to return back to a source of water to lay eggs, to have them fertilized, to continue the species. Well then, a group of amphibians branched off and evolved, and they became reptiles. So what makes reptiles, because when I asked you for examples, a lot of you were kind of mixing up reptiles and amphibians. What makes reptiles different from amphibians along these lines?
They have scales instead of like this the skin that frogs would have, and they lay eggs like actual shells, and like the frogs they lay like little like gooey shells like jelly. I think you said that yesterday.
Yep, correct. And so what does that allow reptiles to do? Kendall? Yes, they can basically live all of their lives out of the water, including reproduction. And so what we're going to talk about are a bunch of the adaptations that reptiles have that allow them to spend all of their lives out of the water. So first of all, one important one is, like Matt was just mentioning, body covering. Because what did amphibians have? Just a thin skin. And if exposed to, a very warm environment, dry conditions, it's pretty easy for amphibians to dehydrate and dry out, and they wouldn't be able to survive. However, reptiles have a body covering of what? Scales. Okay? So reptiles have a body covered in very fine scales that are dry. And those scales are waterproof. They keep all of the moisture in the reptile's body so that it doesn't evaporate. And so that allows them to be much more resistant to dry conditions than a fish or an amphibian would. Those scales are pretty neat. They can change colors, as you probably have heard of chameleons and other reptiles can change colors. They're protective. You ever held a snake or a lizard or something? They're dry. It's not like in a fish. Fish have scales, but they secrete that mucus outside of their scales. That makes them sort of slimy when you try and pick them up. Reptiles are dry when you pick them up because of those scales. Like fish and amphibians, reptiles have the same body temperature, which was what?
Cold-blooded.
Right, they are cold-blooded. Which means they do not regulate their body temperature internally. But they do sometimes regulate their body temperature using different behaviors. If you ever spent time in a place where there are many small reptiles, when I was a kid, we used to go to Florida, and there's those anole lizards, those green lizards are only about this big. You guys familiar with those? They're all over the place. And what I would often see is that on like the patio or the sidewalk in the morning, these small lizards would go on the sidewalk. They'd go and hang on the screen when the sun came out. What are they trying to do? James? Yeah, they're trying to warm up their body temperature. When cold-blooded animals' body temperature drops, they become slow and inactive. So they go into an area where they can absorb the sun's rays, and that raises their body temperature so they can be more active. And then in the heat of a very hot day, what do?
Stay in shade.
Stay in the shade, go in the water, dig a hole. Find a place where they can go away from the sun to help cool their body back down. So they can't control their body temperature internally like we can, but they do have behaviors that help them to adjust their body temperature to the proper condition. Yep.
It's the same thing like kind of my grandma like she lives in South Carolina, but like she was in a condo, so there's like people around her. Like there's like a bunch of lizards there, like little ones. And they instead of like being on screens and stuff, they climb like on the what's the thing in the house that's like plastic?
Like the siding?
Yeah, siding, and then like there's like stairs to get up, and like they go on like the railings.
Yeah, so they basically would arrange themselves anywhere they can where the sun's going to be shining on them to warm up their body. Or if you ever had a pet reptile at home, what do you put in their cage with them? Heated stuff, rocks or heat mats or stuff like that, or a light. That's because they need that heat to help warm up their body. Now fertilization is going to be quite different. Because some reptiles can live their lives away from the water, well, they can't just lay eggs and then have them fertilized, because sperm cells swim, they have a flagellum, and they need a way to get to the egg. And so they can't do that in sand, on dry land. So instead, reptiles were the first class of vertebrates that evolved internal fertilization. So what that means is the female inside of her body has ovaries which produce eggs. But then to fertilize those eggs, the male deposits sperm cells inside of the female's body. That's internal fertilization. Inside of the female's body, okay, those sperm cells can swim to fertilize the egg. And once an egg is fertilized, in reptiles, a shell around it forms, a waterproof shell, and then those eggs are released and laid on land usually. Okay? But that's a small little sort of waterproof way to keep a moist environment inside of the egg while the embryo is developing. And because of this, reptiles do not produce hundreds of eggs at one time. They produce, whatever, a few eggs, up to 10 or so eggs. So they don't need to produce as many, because it's much more likely for them to be fertilized because there's that internal fertilization. It's not just releasing sperm into the water to fertilize the eggs. The sperm is actually deposited right near the eggs for it to fertilize. And also those shells help protect those young for a while. Now, reptile eggs are not, like if you imagine a chicken egg that you eat for breakfast. Reptile eggs don't have that brittle, hard shell like a bird egg. They have like a softer, more flexible, often described as a leathery shell. Okay? And sometimes you might see reptile eggs, like if you ever go hiking in wet areas. I used to take my 9th grade classes when I taught 9th grade down to the Utica Marsh every year in the springtime. And we'd often see, turtle eggs that the young had hatched, where you could find them on the side of the trail. If you pick them up, they're soft and leathery. They're not hard and sort of crunchy. So those eggs provide a nice little warm, watery environment where the embryo inside grows and develops until it's ready, and then it breaks out of that shell, and then you have the young reptiles emerge. Okay. So the eggs are usually laid on land. And then the embryo develops inside of the egg. So we call that external development. Again, it's not developing inside of the female, it's developing in that egg somewhere outside of the body. There you see a turtle in the process of laying one of those. Now if you remember amphibians, or let's start with fish. How many chambers did fish have in their hearts? Just 2. An atrium where blood came in, and a ventricle which pumped the blood out. Amphibians evolved what? A 3-chambered heart, where there's 2 atria, One brought in deoxygenated blood, one brought in oxygenated blood, and then one ventricle where they kind of mix together. Reptiles have what we call a 3.5 chambered heart. Okay, and that may sound weird, but this is what it looks like. So you have two atrium on top still, where blood enters, and then the ventricle. But this ventricle actually has a wall that almost splits it into two separate chambers, but it doesn't quite go all the way. And the benefit of this type of heart is that the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood stay pretty much separate. There's a little bit of mixing that goes on here, but the two types of blood stay more separate than in a 3-chambered heart. And so when we talk about reptiles, our examples, big categories, snakes, lizards, turtles, alligators, crocodiles, those are all reptiles. Any questions about anything related to reptiles? Okay.